Hi, I'm Jack Cox, and this is a panel talking about living with HIV and activism or engaging the disease. And with me are two long-term survivors, and I'll have them introduce themselves. And let's start with Jerry.
My name is Jerry Walker, and I was first diagnosed HIV positive in 1989.
And I'm Jack Cox, and I tested positive in October 1985.
And I should not make mine complicated because it isn't. It is, but I don't want it for purposes of here. So I guess I would say that I tested positive in 1986. I knew I was positive before that. I think many of us had those episodes.
So, our intention is to talk about 25 years of dealing with this disease from an insider's point of view, and sort of first kind of to talk about what it was like in the early days of HIV, and sort of what was it like?
Well, for me, it was really very scary. A lot of my friends were getting sick, and a lot of my friends were dying, and my partner got sick. At first, he was diagnosed with severe asthma. They couldn't figure out what was going on, and by the time they did, a year later, he had full-blown AIDS and died 2 years after being diagnosed. And the odd thing about it is that he was 30 years old, so people were dying at a very young age. And now I kind of look around, and the folks that I thought I would grow old with are no longer here. So I have a new group of friends, thank God, and have really dedicated myself to do something about this disease.
And I think of myself as kind of an activist, and when I first started out with this disease, I suspected I might have had it, but we didn't know. And in those days, it was all thinking about other people, even though you might have suspected you yourself were positive. So you looked at the drama that unfolded. It was beyond imagination. It was desperation. Which is why we started IFAR, the International Foundation for Alternative Research in AIDS. We were seeing people that are doing just about everything. And I could probably go over some of that dinitrochlorobenzene, that stuff you rubbed on your stomach to elicit a response, an immune response. People were getting stung by bees. And you hear about that even now today. You hear about that new thing that they're doing in research. But basically there were everything from African witch doctors to South American gurus and people from all over the world that probably had some good things, but maybe weren't at all profound, but could have contributed. And certainly the idea was hope. You know, people were doing these things, and I said, well, it may not help them physically, but if they feel like they're getting something out of it, it puts them in a better spirit. So I think we've talked about mind-body relationships. So our organization thought, well, we want to meet out where we can find out whether there's real benefit beyond the placebo effect or the benefit that you maybe imagined. So we never really got the money together because there's, as you know, difficult to get that kind of money together. So you realize that maybe you have to take another stance. So we basically went into education, and we wound up with this kind of a program, television program. But the drama was unfolding. We're now seeing people that are taking treatments that are useful. So the old days are much different, I think, than they are today.
I was living in San Francisco when AIDS started emerging in '81, and I didn't test until I came back to Portland in late '85. And the reason I tested was that my partner had tested positive in March of that year when the ELISA test was first available, and he was having symptoms that he couldn't explain, so that's why that happened. And I can tell you that for me, the time between then and say 1994 was so grim. It was just like you had to keep positive, but you kind of gritted your teeth to get down the road with it. We started in the middle 80s. We started support groups for HIV positive asymptomatic people because we knew that if we were isolated, and if we ended up alone and disconnected with this, that we were going to get really sick, and that any hope that we had with this particular disease was, or any disease at all, was connecting with people. We learned that from women. We learned from women with cancer, and we learned from people with heart disease. And frankly, a lot of people, a big part of the people who showed us how to do all this social part of living with this disease were women, and lesbian women in particular, who cared a lot about the gay community. And so anyhow, it was a grim time. It was so hard. It was like, it was like you looked in the paper. You didn't want to look in the paper because you knew that 2 or 3 people that you knew were going to be in the obituary column, and people that you worked with. I lost 100 people in that period. So, what was the time? What changed, and what was the pivotal point for kind of when things changed?
I'd love to answer that one. It was the protease inhibitors. It was a moment when there was a big change because it was that conference in Vancouver, BC, the international conference. Was that 96? Yeah, it was 96. And then 10 years later, we have another conference in Canada on the other shore, and we're talking about 10 years later with really useful treatment. Understanding that this wasn't the end of it, it was the beginning of the end. We looked at the possibilities of treatment that would be useful, but we then realized we had to do combination, or they called it drug cocktails. And that was the time, I think, when the hope really became, hey, we can do something about this disease, not just imagine that we can. And that was, I think, the medicinal turning point. And then after that, I think people very quickly were talking about the Lazarus syndrome. People that were literally, you were knowing that you, like you say, you were looking in the paper, is this person here yet? You almost didn't want to call them. And they weren't. And then you'd see them on the street and they looked healthy. And they managed to come back from the dead.
Well, another turning point also is when HIV actually started permeating the general population. Initially, it was thought of as a gay white male disease, but there are many people of color and many people of all nationalities that have HIV. Most recently in the Oregonian, I saw an article saying that relatively soon, HIV will become the leading cause of death for all people ages 22 to 44. That's significant. And when that type of information becomes public knowledge, people then wake up and take notice. And I think that really is making other people who normally wouldn't look at this as an issue for them, making them. It is.
I sort of want to pick up on something that you said earlier, Jerry, that at some point we stopped kind of doing the drama, the internal drama of it, and started knowing that we had to do something about it in a bigger arena. And my first awareness of when that happened, I was getting the PWA news line. Do you remember that? It was a thing from New York. But the Denver principals, when there was this big meeting in Denver, and people with HIV got together and said, okay, here's the deal with this disease. We're not going to, we are going to be part of every decision that's made about this disease in terms of policy, in terms of programs, and we're going to take control of the definition of this disease. We are not going to be steamrolled by a bunch of people, well-intentioned, but who are not us. So, and to do that, we need to be involved in everything that goes on about HIV, and I think that we did that. Or I think we tried really hard to do that. We tried to do that here. I know that there was a lot of that happened on the national level also,
yes.
and the international level, so that it wasn't just a matter feeling like, God, we got this awful thing happen to us, and we're just kind of waiting for the steamroller to come and flatten us out.
You felt kind of helpless, and you didn't want to feel that way, and
Yeah.
you acted out so it didn't.
And you found people who were doing this, who felt the same way, and then you started making things happen. That's sort of how.
Because the national issue was, is a whole story. We could spend a whole morning talking about that, but just to capsulize it, we're a lot of very smart people in the AIDS gay community predominantly, but living with AIDS, and some people in the IDU and in the community as well, who just said, hey, we're not going to take it. We're going to, we want a place at the table. There is a place at the table for us as consumers. And that, I think, is profound, because in the FDA there had been no place up to that point. Now we're invited into meetings, and it's almost like a fait accompli. We got to get a community person, and they'll invite, they'll say, hey, is there somebody that needs to be in this meeting? So I think that's, and we're hoping to transplant this to other diseases as well. I know like you said, we picked some good things up from certain communities and but I think we're transplanting back some of those things which needed to be reconstructed as far as social issues.
Yeah, I think that's also, I think that's true. And the other thing is, and it's another topic that, Jerry, you talked about, and that's the diverse character of this disease. When I first became involved with HIV, half of the people that I knew I was involved with were hemophiliacs, people with hemophilia. They're all dead. They're all dead. And as it began emerging more and more, people that I worked with and collaborated with and was impassioned by were African Americans, and a little later Latinos and Latinas and women who are not unfortunately represented here today because they were busy tending children or doing something else. So, and that, I think that one of the things that we need always to do with any of this kind of stuff is be aware of how it affects us, but how it affects people who are not us, and and it's going to be different, and how do we make sure that every one of those people is represented in the outcomes of this stuff. So,
I really think one of the reasons why some of the early prevention efforts were not successful is because they didn't take into account the diversity that we needed to use to attack the issue. A lot of people who were people of color, who were heterosexual, would look at some of the prevention messages and say, this is targeted to gay white men. It's not people who are like me, so this isn't my issue. But the real deal is it crosses all classes, all genders, all races. And now some of the prevention messages are very culturally specific and very targeted. And I really applaud that, because it really does send the message that HIV is not a disease that is relegated to one segment of the population.
This issue of, when I was watching buses, little things on the tops of the buses inside the banners that they put in Washington, they had one that showed, this is the face of HIV, and there's a whole bunch of people, different walks of life, different faces. And I think that was a good one that gave the broad picture right there. But truly, we do need to have culturally specific messages as well. So I think that was one of the things, and we talked about the issue of the people who are being tested we should have those messages so that those people know everyone knows to get tested. And that we also have the messages as far as inclusion in trials. Absolutely. Is another big one. And because if we can't prove that it's useful in all populations, it isn't proven. I mean, we haven't had the people in the trials, they're not going to answer the question for those. And there is, as we know now, specific differences genetically in different populations that will make it less well taken for one person, one particular medicine, as opposed to another population. So.
Which is one reason why I never took AZT, is because I read printed stories saying that there were not people of color involved in AZT clinical trials. So I just felt like, well, it may not.
It might not be for you.
It may not be for me.
Yeah.
So it's one of the things we need to keep in mind. One of the groups that I was thinking of, especially that I didn't connect with until the late 90s were prison populations. There's a whole world of people that were doing things themselves, trying to make themselves safe, to take care of themselves, but they didn't have any access to the larger outside world because we were all busy taking care of our people or something. You know what I mean? So, and I want to remind good thinking people, including corrections, that it was people living with HIV who brought corrections and public health together on this topic in Oregon. We made them aware that there were dollars available for treatment. We made corrections aware, and we made public health aware that there were people in the population who could use those surplus dollars that we had at that time. We don't have them anymore. So, but we, people with HIV, sat in on all the meetings. We shaped policy. In the metropolitan area, we provided treatment, alternative treatment, mental health treatment in areas at a higher rate than any place else in the country. So I guess what I'm saying is I want people with any kind of disease to feel effective, and that's one of the ways of dealing with life-threatening illness, is to feel like you got some control over it. And you may not win in the long run, but it doesn't have to roll out in anybody's way except your own. So.
The same thing when you go to lobby not lobby, but educate the Congress and the Senate, is to let them know that you're banging your head on the wall yet still, because we don't have the answers. We don't have all the money for the people that need to be treated.
Right.
So it isn't to say like that I can go, well, I'm not going to go because I know I'm not going to win. You got to let them know you're still mad. You still need this money. We still need people to be treated that don't have funding. So.
And we need always to be aware that it's a huge world problem. It's not just Portland, Oregon. It's not just Oregon. It's not just the United States. It isn't just North America. It's the goddamn world. So, or the God blessed world.
Absolutely.
Either way, yeah.
Well, thank you. This is all part of IFAR. Do you want me to say anything special?
No, just thank you for. I thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. I love being had.